Every application, from large to small, even the tiniest one, will eventually need to divide its code into multiple separate files. I mean, nobody wants to endlessly scroll on a single file. We need a way to organize our code and set dependencies. And every language has a different way. Kotlin has packages, Swift has frameworks, and Objective-C had headers. But what about TypeScript? Well, if we are talking about TypeScript, we need to talk about JavaScript. And if we are talking about JavaScript, then we need to talk about ES modules or ECMAScript modules, or just modules. This is the standard way for organizing your TypeScript and JavaScript code. And in this episode, I will show you everything I know about modules. We will start from the syntax, we will see named and default exports, we will talk about types, how you export them, how you reuse them, what's the difference if you don't export your types. We will install and use packages, and I will show you tips for better imports, dynamic imports, immutability, index files. We will also talk about CommonJS because a lot of Node.js legacy applications are still using it on production up until today. So at the end of this video, you will learn how to modularize your code for better organization, readability, and of course, code reuse. So let's get into it right after the intro. Let me bring the intro. Hello friends, it's Nikos here and welcome back to my TypeScript course. If you are new to this channel, this is a series of videos about TypeScript. Every week we are exploring a different feature of the language and we are really killing it, so make sure you subscribe because you don't want to miss one of the next episodes. I'm also preparing another episode about namespaces. In that one we will also compare modules to namespaces to see which one we should use under which circumstances. But now, let's create our first module. To show you how modules work, I have created this tiny TypeScript project. Basically, I use the default settings, and what I have here is an index.ts, which will be the main file, the root file of my application. And I also created the exports.ts, which currently contains some stuff, a function, a variable, a class, and a type. And what I want is to basically reuse these things in my index.ts. Now, somebody will try to use the switch type. For example, here I can have a state, which is a switch, and this can be either on or off. And you will be surprised, but this is actually currently working. And the reason that is working, we will talk about later in the video when we will be creating an application. But basically, this is not the default behavior. A lot of people, a lot of TypeScript developers are disabling this feature. So this is working because we are using the global scope, and switch is currently in the global scope. So theoretically, all the files in our TypeScript project can use this switch. But you understand that this is not the best practice because if we have two switches, two types with the same name, then their names will collide. So we don't want this to happen. And that's why there is a better way. We can use modules. So to use modules, we only need to learn two new keywords. The one keyword that we want to learn is export. This basically creates the modules. And I can use export in every single item here. So I can basically export everything, right? I can export a function, I can export a constant, I can export a class, or I can export TypeScript types. And now in my index.ts, the way to consume these modules is the second secret keyword, import, as you may have guessed. So here I am saying I want to import something from, and here I specify the path of this module. So for example, we are using relative paths. So here we are using exports. And this syntax here is basically familiar to you. We are using this structuring here because we don't want to import everything to this file. We want to import only, let's say, the API key and the switch type. So everything else is not needed because what we want to do is to store our API key here and create a state which is a switch and assign a value. A couple of notes here. Basically, this is called a named export because when we are exporting something, we are giving it a name. So this has a name add, this has a name API underscore key. And here in the import statement, we are using this name. So that's why this is called named export. And you will say we are using this structuring here. We don't want to import things that we are not consuming. So if here I say, for example, person, if I don't consume this, normally we get an error here that, not an error, a warning that person is declared, but its value is never read. So maybe you want to just remove this guy from here so that we don't unnecessarily importing stuff. So that's the key. If we are importing something here, it will be actually transpiled and it will be included in the final code we are shipping to production. And we don't want to do that. That's why we are specifically importing the things we are consuming. Okay, perfect. You will also notice that here we are using a relative path. We don't put the file extension, so we don't have to type .ts or .js, but for every other file, for example, if you have CSS, the extension is important. And there is a way to have absolute paths without having the dot here, but it's not really a good way because files are moving around. And one cool thing is that your editor, Visual Studio Code, but pretty much every other editor these days, is smart enough to recognize when you want to use something from a different module. As you can see here, it highlights that this is in the exports module. So when I press enter, it automatically imported my class, and now I can use it without a problem. I will revert this. We don't want to use this class for now. And of course, if we want, we don't need to have the file in the same folder. We can create a subfolder, for example, I don't know, modules or whatever you like, and move this file inside this folder. And if I move it, Visual Studio is smart enough. Again, it will prompt me if I want to change the import statements, the paths here. So now it did change the path, and now my application is working fine. Imagine if you had like various different files and you just move one file, the import statements across your whole application needs to be updated, and the editor is doing automatically for you. Pretty simple. You export something and then you import it to another file, the destination. This is a declarative way to define file dependencies in all TypeScript and, of course, JavaScript applications. This is the standard way of creating modules in our applications. Now, there is another secret keyword which is called default. Every file has one single slot for import. For example, here we can export default one of these items here. So I'm not exporting this function. Instead, I will export it as a default module. And all this does is pretty simple. So instead of using this destructuring here, I can import this thing and name it however I like, for example, my module. And I use comma here to separate the default from the named export. So this is basically if you want to import multiple things from the same file. Of course, you can have two lines of code, one for your named exports, imports, and one for your name exports and one for your default. Although this is a terrible idea, it's better to have them in the same line of code. And now I have access to my module, and my module is basically the add function. So it's basically this function here, but it's not named because it doesn't have a name. I choose to name it my module. Of course, for simplicity, we tend to name the file. For example, this will be add.ts because it simply, we want to match what we are exporting here as a default, and this will also be add. So more or less, we have a naming convention because all these things can have different names. The file can have a different name, the folder can have a different name, the internal function can have a different name, and your import name can have a different name. So to simplify it a bit, we are by convention using the same name everywhere. So this is basically a reserved spot which simplifies exports and import statements. Think of it as the return keyword that every function has. So here, for example, I can return something from this function. This is a very similar thing. I have a file, and from within this file, I want to return a module. And the common pattern here is that we normally have a single file, for example, button, and this button can be TS6, for example, if you are working with React. And here we can create this button function, which is just a React component. And then at the end of the file, we are default exporting this button here. So again, the file has the same name, the function has the same name, and when we are importing this thing, we are going to use the same name. In this way, we are basically tracking where everything is in our code. And the pattern is that when we have a module, when we have a file, we normally export with the default keyword. We are exporting whatever that is. Is it the main util? Is it a component? Is it, for example, a class? But within this file, we may have some additional helper utility functions. For example, here we can have something like an interface. So I can use export interface, and I can do a named export for this utility helper thingy. So I don't need to basically, every time I want to use this button, I don't need to use the bracket. So it's a little bit more convenient, I have to say, if you want to use the default exports. I hope you are still following. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. Now let's see some tips and tricks for importing modules. Okay, this happens to me all the time. I have one module that exports something. Let's say here, for example, I have add, which exports API key, and I have another module. Let's create that one, another .ts, which basically exports another API key. Of course, I need the const here because I need to declare what this is. And yeah, let's try to import this one. So import. And now, as you can see, I have two API keys. One is in my add module, and the other one is to inside this another file. So let's try to import them both. And yeah, TypeScript will not really like this one because we have a duplicate identifier. It's like having two functions with the same name, right? This is impossible. So in order to fix this issue, we need to either remove one of them, or we can rename, we can put an alias for one of them. So if this, for example, can be as API key 1, and this can be as API key 2. So now my API key will be API key, and I can choose which one I want. And there you have it. Basically, we are using the aliases of destructuring to provide a different name for our named exports. So both named and default exports can be renamed within our import statement. So here, for example, I can have a different name, add fn, or here I can use this as to change the name of the variable. Now, there is a way to import everything. And what I mean by that, let's remove this line of code here. What if we had like hundreds of named exports within this add module here? So it will not be really efficient to import every single one of them individually. So instead of that, what we can do is basically use this asterisk here, and with that we can say import everything. It's like a wildcard as, and we give it a name. I don't know, add module, and then we use this add module to get what we want. So here, for example, add module API key, add module dot switch, and this add is basically the default one. So this will not work. Add module dot default, and yeah, that will work perfectly fine. So again, what we have done here is to import every single export statement from the module add, and we give it a name. Again, we can be creative here. We can choose the name that we want, and then we use this name to refer to all these items inside our add file. Pretty useful, pretty easy, and trust me, I have used this multiple times. Now, another thing I want to show you is if we have another file, let's say, let's create a file init. I don't know, for whatever reason, you have init.ts, and here, for example, let's have console log. Let's do some initialization here. What you can do is basically, you don't need to export anything from a file. You can still import this file. I can import directly my init file without exporting anything and without selecting what I want to import. This will basically evaluate this file. So every time we are importing or every time we are executing this file here, this console log will be displayed on the terminal. And this is really cool if you want to import, for example, here you can import some styles.css, so some central styles, especially if you're using Webpack or some other module bundler in your application. You can set some defaults, or you can run some, I don't know, scripts that you want to run at the root level, but there is nothing to import or export from this file. So this is how you do something like that. And of course, if you use Webpack, you can import any other kind of file. So for example, you can have a JSON, and you can get data from data.json, and Webpack will convert this JSON to a JavaScript object, and then it will be available in the scope of this file so that you can manipulate this data. It will not actually change the data from the JSON, it will just copy it on memory, and then you can basically assign it to some variable or export it directly. So pretty cool stuff, and yeah, ping me if you want me to have another video for Webpack. I think it may be interesting. As we've seen, it's very common in ES modules to destructure import statements and select what we want to import. This not only improves readability, but it also helps reducing the application size, the bundles, the JavaScript that the user has to download. And if okay, we are building a small application like this one here. It's not a significant amount of code that we are talking about. But if you are building a very large application, then if you can reduce some files because the modules will load more modules and more modules, and the story goes on, then this will improve the overall performance of your application. So definitely try to be very picky when you are importing modules. Now there is another pattern that I see a lot of developers falling into this trap. They are using destructuring when they are exporting something. So here, for example, instead of exporting all these things separately, somebody can go at the end of the file and have a single export statement, and here they can choose what they want to export. For example, they can export add, they can export API key, person, and suites. Thankfully, this is not working for TypeScript types, so I'm going to remove this one because, TypeScript types, TypeScript code in general, will not make it at runtime. It only runs at build time. This thing here will work perfectly fine. I can replace this part, import add module directly, and here I will, of course, I cannot use my suites type anymore. I will have to export this separately, and I can rename this to add. And this will work. Of course, we don't need this anymore, and we need to import the suites separately. Now again, this will work perfectly fine, but this is not really a good practice, because here, instead of exporting every single item separately, I'm creating an object and I'm putting everything as a property inside that object. So instead of exporting multiple things, I'm exporting a single thing, and then I'm using that single thing in my import statements. So a lot of module bundlers will actually include everything that you put in this file, regardless if you are using it or not, which will have a significant impact in the application load times. So there you have it. Avoid having such a syntax here. It's basically better when you have separate export statements. So I will revert this code and never look back. The fun with TypeScript begins as you start exploring third-party packages. Jeff Atwood said, any application that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript. There is a huge collection of packages for every single thing. Utility functions, UI components, machine learning algorithms, literally whatever you can imagine. And these are all modules, basically packages, but here's how you can install them. So I will show you a very quick demo here. I'm firing up my terminal. It's basically pointing to the right folder, and all I want to do is npm install React. And I want you to pay attention here. I'm not running it yet. Let's open the package.json file to see what it contains. As we can see, we have one dev dependency, which is TypeScript. And if I go here to my node modules folder, you will see this is a secret folder, node modules, which is the default folder in every project that Node.js stores your npm modules. And here you will find TypeScript. So this is basically a module, a package we have installed. And although in our code we don't need to consume TypeScript, that's why it is in our dev dependencies, because this is used to build our application, but it's not being used to actually run when we are running our application at runtime. But now let's install React. Let's press enter here, and you will notice that npm has automatically changed my package.json file. Here we have now dependencies, because React is actually being used on at runtime. So that's why we have React here, and if we open our node modules folder, you will see that now we have more things. We have React, obviously, we just installed React, but we also have these two common packages between these two packages that we have installed. So everything that you have installed will be here, and sometimes you can even open and read the source code. Sometimes the code is minified, but yeah, this is how the NPM modules are working. And all I have to do to use React, of course, is to import React from React. Now here you will see we have already an auto-completion by our editor, and again, we don't need to use relative paths when we are using some of the packages, because we just need to provide the exact same name that the package is called here in our package.json file. So that was a very small parenthesis. Of course, React with TypeScript is a big, let's say, topic. We will open this topic in a following episode. Now, as your application grows, more and more modules are being introduced. And the drawback here is that the more modules you add, the bigger and the slower the application loading speed becomes. So to speed up loading times, a common pattern is to optimize an application based on routes. So when you are visiting a route, the user will only download this portion of the website of the JavaScript bundle, and not the whole application the moment they enter the website. And it doesn't make sense, for example, when you are visiting the dashboard to load, I don't know, the settings view, because the user hasn't been yet in this route. To do that, we use dynamic imports. And let me show you the syntax. So here I am, I'm using again the button, and all I want to do is to dynamically load the button in our in my index file. You saw that I removed the React dependency because we are not actually using React. And all I have to do is create an asynchronous function, import button, and here we basically create the button module, and we await for the import of the button, which is inside modules button. Of course, I need to use the function keyword here. That will work perfectly fine. Okay, so this code here will not be executed when you are running your application. So I have to manually call this function import button potentially when something will happen in my application. I don't know, load button equals true, whatever. And then here I can simply say, now import button. And then I can do a lot of things. This is basically the logic behind it. But again, it's much more efficient if you use this function, this asynchronous function and this dynamic import together with your router to create dynamic routes. This is a new TypeScript feature, but I'm pretty sure you will find it with the current installation of TypeScript. Somebody may think that since we are exporting something and we are importing it in another file, this automatically becomes immutable. But is it? Let's figure it out. So I'm here in my previous add.ts module, and what I will try to do is export a const. Let's put this a little bit before the actual default export, because I don't know, again, as a convention, we put the default either at the top of the file or at the bottom of the file, just to make sense, because it's very easy to get lost when you have a lot of exports within a file. So here, for example, we can have, instead of a const, let's spice it up a bit. Let's have a let, or even let's have a var, even better. And here, let's have a name. I I will use my name here. And let's import, again, it's a common pattern. You can import things whatever you want, but it's a common pattern to have it at the very top of the file. So here, let's import name, which is named from modules/add. Okay, name is here. And now let's go here and try to assign another name here. And then let's try to console log this guy. Well, you will notice that TypeScript immediately tries to protect you here because it immediately says that we cannot assign anything to name since it's an import. However, TypeScript, if I disable you, let's say that we have ts ignore here, then this error goes away, right? And what I can do is fire up my terminal and try to run npx tsc, and what will happen if we try to run our index.js? Oops. Yeah, that was expected, because the golden rule here is that ES module imports in JavaScript are not immutable. So whatever you do, just be careful, because yes, TypeScript may and will protect you from these mistakes, but if for some reason TypeScript is not configured properly, or if for some reason, I don't know, something is happening, weird things are happening, right, in your code, then you will have a lot of surprises. So remember that modules are not immutable. You should always use const instead of var or let, because then it's technically impossible, because this will cause a error. No, it doesn't. So yeah, I didn't save the file. Okay, so let's try to run it again. Again, it works. Okay, so never mind. Just don't rename stuff. And after this embarrassing moment, let's talk about path resolution. So far we said that we don't need to use the .ts extension when we are importing a JavaScript or a TypeScript file. So JS and TS extensions can be omitted, should be omitted, let's say. But it happens that sometimes we have both these files. So which file will win? The maths. So of course, obviously, since we are using TypeScript files will have a priority here. So if it happens that you have a file with the same name, .js and .ts, then the TS file will win. However, it's not really a good practice to have two identical files with different extensions. So maybe you want to do something there with the file names. A similar naming convention is the one with the index files. It's like a special name a file could have. And let me show you what I mean. So here we are back in our application folder, and what I will try to do is create a utils folder. So this will be a folder utils, and inside this folder I will create a new index.ts file. And let's add a couple of functions here. Export function deep merge. Let's have an empty function. Let's add another one. It's free. Okay, so theoretically, we have these two utility functions here. Now, if we go back to my index file, let's put them side by side. So what I can do is delete everything that is here, because we don't want to use them anymore. And let's try to use deep merge. I'm pressing enter, and TypeScript, my editor, basically automatically adds the import statement, not TypeScript, my editor. So something weird here you will notice is that here we don't have the name index, right? Obviously, we can go here and say /index because this file exists. However, it will work even if we omit the index file. And that's because folders, every folder in Node.js has this naming convention. So index.ts is, or index.js is a reserved, let's say, file name that acts as an index for this specific folder. So this is why, in a similar way that in our root folder of our application, we have the index.ts. We can use something else if we change the ts config JSON. However, by default, this is the main file name which is being used for the root file of our application. And that's why when we are in subfolders, the index.ts will be a default file, which means this gives us a benefit. Okay, for utility functions that are small like this one, we have utils as a folder and we have an index file. A single file can manage everything. However, as our list with the utility functions is growing, then it will be impossible to have everything in this index file. We will need to eventually break this to multiple files. And here is a common practice that people are using. So here, for example, you can create a file map. And let's move our function map into this file. We will have a default export because now we have only a single thing, only a single function. We don't need to use named exports anymore. And we will do the same thing with deep merge. Let's copy this function here. Awesome. So now our index file is empty. Now it's empty, which means that if I go here, this import statement will simply not work. I will have to specifically specify that now I want to import the deep merge. And since this is a default export, I have to also remove the brackets. Now it works. However, I don't want that. I want to still be able to use my index file as an index file. So here, what I can do, and this is a very nice pattern that you can use in your applications, I can export deep merge from deep merge. So there is a way to use the export keyword to import something and then rename it and then export it back. So for this to work, you need to say, I am importing default from deep merge, and I am renaming it as deep merge. So here, obviously, I can use whatever name I want. And the same thing I can do with my map function. Here you go. So now my import will work perfectly fine. And this is really great because I have a folder, utils. This folder, this module here started from a single file. And then I decided to move away from this index file and break my code apart to multiple files. Without having to change anything in my index file, I was able to use these special export statements to make it possible. And this is the pattern I wanted to show you. It's really, really popular. Every application will eventually need to use this pattern. So make sure that you understand, and you can ask me questions if something is not clear. Before ES modules became a standard in JavaScript, there were a lot of different patterns for implementing modules in JavaScript. The most popular one is still something that developers are using today when they are building, especially when they are building Node.js backend applications. It's called CommonJS, and it's the default way that you can build applications with Node and up until recently. So due to the fact that ES modules were not natively supported and available by default in Node.js applications, there are a lot of legacy applications out there that are still relying on CommonJS. Now, I would not recommend using CommonJS in your projects. And if you are a maintainer of such a project, then sooner or later you will eventually have to migrate to ES modules. However, it's useful to understand how CommonJS works and to compare it with ES modules, just to get up to speed when joining such projects. So let's briefly review that. Now we'll try to compare the syntax of ES modules with CommonJS, just for you to understand the differences. I'm using my button here, and I have updated my index.ts to use this button component. So here in the button.ts, I will put comments to show you how the CommonJS approach is working. This will not necessarily work in TypeScript, so don't try to evaluate and don't try to run this code. However, you can try in an older version of Node to use CommonJS by yourself. So here, instead of export, what we are going to have is module.exports and equals button. That's it. That's all we have to do. Module exports equals button. And that should do it. So here, instead of import, what we can do with CommonJS is const button require, and here it's basically the same logic. You put modules/button. So the path part is the same. Whatever applies for the paths for ES modules apply for CommonJS. One last thing, it's really interesting if we go to our tsconfig file, and here you can see all the compiler options. One of them, of course, is which version of JavaScript we want to use, but another configuration option is what kind of module system we want to use when we generate our code. So every time you compile your code with the TypeScript compiler, it will produce this kind of modular code. And here, as you can see, by default, TypeScript is still using CommonJS. And that is for a reason. This is the golden standard, unfortunately, for even delivering, packaging modules. And yeah, that's basically the reason I wanted to add this parenthesis here. We don't need to learn this. If you are building a greenfield application, please ignore CommonJS altogether. However, it makes sense when you are opening existing JavaScript files or packages or modules to understand how their code is structured. And you can quickly understand if they are using this require keyword here, that is CommonJS. In my blog post about modules, you can find everything I presented to you in this video, including the coding examples. You'll find the link in the description down below. Now, modules is one of these features that you really need to play, to experiment with in order to learn it properly. And if you want to spend some extra time, I have prepared for you a hands-on exercise. All you have to do is to enroll to my TypeScript course. It's free, and you will also find the link in the description of this video. I want to thank all the people who joined my course and all of you who are supporting my channel. I will keep adding exclusive content for you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if yes, press the thumbs up button and don't forget to share it with your friends on your social media. Now, we have more videos, so click here to subscribe. or click here to find my playlist with all the videos in this series. Have a creative day and see you in the next one.